So, with Save TF2, you saw many things. You saw a lot of people coming together. You saw a lot of people that didn't know about TF2 kind of talk about TF2 and have interest in TF2. You saw a lot of older people returning to the game. You saw many things. And one of the things you definitely see going along with that as well, though, a non-negligible portion of people just looking at us, looking at the community, and wondering, why does this game deserve to be updated still? Why do these people feel entitled to have their game be supported when so many other older games are able to sustain themselves and their own communities? And there's a few easy answers to that, right? I'd say the top two. One, the bot problem. Okay, sure. That's not entirely unique to TF2, but that's kind of out there yet, kind of pressing. But secondly, you would see people answering with the community. Okay. And I think that's definitely a fair answer. I think the community we have is a wonderful thing. It's super unique. And I think our community ultimately, like, just what we're willing to do for it, that we're still willing to, like, pay, you know, invest in the game, give all this time and care into it, I think it definitely warranted it. But I think there's something more that you could do here. I think that there's a certain lens you could view this from, right? To help sort of better understand from an outside perspective why the game deserves it. And to answer that, what you have to do is just ask yourself, why does TF2 as a game deserve and have the community that it does? And you might ask yourself, why does that question matter here? Well, there's a lot of people, you know, there was PewDiePie's amazing video, kind of having a lot of competitive experiences on it. You have a lot of people that have talked about their own experiences with the game, but then I think it's also important to kind of note and think about why the game kind of developed the way it did from a community standpoint, how it's gotten to where it is today, and how we've gotten the chance to have all these amazing memories of the game. And so that's exactly what I'm going to be doing. So I think the very first part of the equation here is just the cosmetics. Now, to elaborate on this, I want you to look at, one, games that don't have any cosmetics and customization. What does that mean? Everybody you play against in a casual environment, everybody that you play against a competitive environment, you purely recognize them for their gameplay and their personality, right? If you go into something without knowledge of what this player's playstyle or username is, or have usernames off for some reason, it's hard for you to identify and recognize them, in a sense, right? So what do cosmetics do, then? Well, honestly, usually not that much. If you look at something like Overwatch, Valorant, Siege, pretty much any game where you have the ability to pay for and spend your money to buy a preset loadout, like a preset set of cosmetics, a costume, well, it's just generic. You're one of a million, and you're just wasting your money on essentially nothing. It's like everybody's just trying to stand out by looking exactly the same because they all are gonna think that one or two skins are the best. And honestly, it kind of just sucks when companies do it, you know? It really just doesn't give you that much ability to really diversify yourself as a player. You know, you're just one of however many other people decided, oh cool, this is my favorite looking outfit too. But anyways, with that ramble aside, TF2, you have three cosmetic slots. I guess 4 if you want to count like little pouches for like spellbooks, anything like that that could visually appear, but for the sake of this, we'll call it 3. Now, what do these 3 little items mean to you? I'll tell you what. The game has a massive virtual economy trading system. You buy, you know, you unbox, you can get unusuals, whatnot. That's a lot of depth. I don't really feel the need to go into that for the sake of this argument, though. The main thing you want to pay attention to is just what appeals to you as a player, you know? You make the investment, you get the choice, you really get the ability to kind of like define and represent yourself the way you want to, instead of just some massive AAA corporation being like, hey, this is a cosmetic, buy this, become one of millions, look unique. You know, it's just not the same when you're looking at some company like Blizzard being like, buy our skins, yo, compared to something like TF2, Valve and TF2, just like having the community add so many items to the game, items that other, like, the people have made, that, you know, people are gonna get accredited for. It kind of gives some attention back in that sense, but also it really just allows for people to use what they want to use. And there's just so many items. Most of them, you know, really aren't that expensive unless you want to get, like, unusuals or anything like that. But, you know, it's still more of a community thing in that sense. You know, there's a whole process to it. There's the marketplace, the virtual economy, all that, which is pretty interesting stuff. Not necessarily the healthiest thing, though, but again, it's still an element. It's still something that kind of makes it unique compared to just going to a store, buying it, and giving X company your money, like a virtual store, that is. And you really allow yourself to fine-tune and tailor to whatever you want to, right? And you got all these options. So let's take a look at this loadout. This loadout, you might recognize this. This would be like the star/store loadout, old TF2 player, streamer, content creator, so you know him. And think about how long ago that was, right? Think about how many people know, like, famous players, content creators, even people just, like, in their own community servers or in, like, the same casual pubs from their cosmetics without having to, like, see their name, without having to pay, like, super great attention to how they play, right? You know, you look at Banny, you look at what he usually uses, and you're like, oh wow, is that Banny? If you see those same cosmetics. And it could be Banny, it could be just somebody using the same cosmetic set. That's kind of the fun of it. But you just don't really get that same sense of visual recognition. I mean, let's say your streamer, your favorite streamer, content creator, whatever, uses X skin out of 8 in whatever game, okay? There's still going to be so many other players using that same exact set. But TF2, just due to how many items there are, the unusuals, all these ways to just sort of set yourself apart, there's that level of visual recognition and identity that really adds to just playing with content creators on community servers, playing with friends, and whatnot, you know. You join a community server with a friend like an Uncletopia, you see their cosmetic set, you're like, hey, I want to focus this person. You know, there's really unspecific though, like it goes super far with just like the competitive to casual audience, like the top players like Banny or really just content creators in general. You see them, and it's just this really cool process, right? But honestly, like, whatever. That's not the biggest thing, it's just something that kind of sets TF2 apart, you know? And that's something that also transcends just like having a class or hero-based system, in a sense. You're not just going to pick X class and look the same as everybody else. You're going to pick X class, you're going to play X way, you're going to use X weapons, and you're going to look like however you want to look from whatever further options that you have. And that really just means, you know, you're able to define yourself more. Now, that's not the most important thing, but that really is important and nice for building up a sense of community, just being able to recognize, being able to have that factor of visual recognition. You know, you look at MMOs, everybody has their signature looks. So it's just like this really big underlying element that I don't think gets the justice it deserves when talking about TF2. Like, I mean, it's easy to just look at it, you know, and be like, oh, cool hat game, but there's just a lot more to it than that. Like, there's actual benefit to it. But anyways, I think the far more important half of the equation there, right? I kind of touched on this just a little bit ago, but okay. Let's take something like Overwatch, yeah? You have classes, aka your heroes. They all have their own abilities and ultimates. There's like 9 million of them, they keep adding more and more of them. The balancing of the game ends up just being a matter of what can we make, like if everything's broken, nothing is broken, right? And that isn't really that good. And because of just like how fundamentally broken and obtuse a lot of the mechanics, heroes, design choices are, it just becomes a cheese fest 99% of the time. How do I outpick my opponents? What hero do I play now, right? And that doesn't really provide power to the player. So the second point I want to establish here is player agency. The first is being able to cosmetically customize for yourself, besides just picking from a set of prearranged options of that are like all in one, like just being able to pick out individual components, and there being like just a sense of reward progression and recognizability for that. But secondly, having a sense of agency and player empowerment in your loadout and weapon choices. So obviously that's not something every game needs. You go to CSGO, you have your weapons, they serve their own purposes, you're gonna see a lot of the same ones. Okay, that's fine, that's part of that genre of game. But what really sets TF2 apart, what really draws people into TF2 in specific, is the art of the subclass. And just how your weapon choice kind of defines you. But here's the thing, it doesn't entirely define you. You don't have to just keep changing to try and counter things, especially in one of the competitive formats of TF2 Highlander, 9v9, okay? You take competitive Overwatch, it's a 6v6, everything's decided what the most powerful meta is at the time and trying to play around and outpick that. You just keep switching classes. And guess what? Nobody's unique then. You are just carbon copy number 999. All that matters is just your own mechanics and the mental side of things. But when it comes to the gameplay itself, you are basically just a clone unless you are just better than other players. Simply put, in an ideal environment where the match actually matters, where it's a tournament. At least in my opinion. And I think on a fundamental level, that's poor game design. But now, TF2, going back to it, let's establish this dynamic. Okay. I want to play Demo Man. Okay. You see the tools you have here. Your grenade launcher, arcs, good direct combat tool, helps to control. Sticky bomb, really good for control, can be used for spamming, can be used for trapping, so that's already a lot of choices just from one thing, right? But then you take a look at some of the other options for his weapons. Okay. Base jumper. Go into the air, parachute, rain death from above. That's interesting. You further evolve that by just becoming something like a jumper. You just jump into the enemy lines, you try and caber pan somebody, you equip the booties, and then not the booties, the base jump, and you just go flying around like a goofball, you use the sticky jumper, okay? That's one option. Use the iron bomber. If, at least in the past, not really anymore, but if you want more controlled spam, more consistency, sure. If you're spamming into a choke point, stock if you want them to roll around. Lock and loot if you really want to take out sentry guns, or if you just want to try and just stop people in their tracks like scouts and whatnot. But the main point I want to establish here, right? The subclass. Okay. Demo Knight. What do you think of when you think of Demo Knight? The answer? Probably either friends yourself from how you play it, or content creator like SolarLight. SolarLight's identity within the community, as a player, is attached to the Demo Knight, right? And that's something that stays consistent. It's not just oh, he can flex between X classes, he could just switch classes faster, pick the perfect hero for X circumstance, It's just you really have the ability to specialize, be known for that, be rewarded for that, and sort of develop that. Now, of course, this specific part of it, it's not really that relevant to competitive, not Demo Knight at least. But then you take something like Battle Mech, again, not really relevant to competitive, but Array 7, Uncle Dane for combat energy can be kind of relevant to competitive. So many options, so many people that are known for those options, right? And so the dynamic this establishes here is that you have a set of tools already going into it as a class, and you are defined by those tools, but you have the ability to kind of specialize from within that set of tools, or kind of inverse some of the parts of the class, or even use a different tool set. But for the most part, right, again, going back to Highlander, you have 9 classes. One of each class. You can swap with another player on your team class-wise if you really need to, but that might hurt your team if they're not good at whatever class that you want them to swap to. There is good flexibility is good because of that, just being able to swap. But the more important thing, right, because you can't just keep switching and finding the perfect counter based off of class hero choice alone, you either have to just become better mechanically, so you can't, and not be relying on trying to out-cheese somebody, or you find something, some sort of advantage you can press on them, right? You can't just always keep switching classes compared to something like Overwatch to perfectly solve a situation. Okay? let's say you're struggling a lot with taking out a sentry gun, right? You don't just find the perfect hero to switch to deal with that. You can just run specialized items for it. If the engineer is running the Wrangler, you can run the Enforcer. You shoot the gun, it counters it, right? But that counter comes from within the same toolset of the spy. I wouldn't say it's... You can't really say that, oh, you can only have one of each class's argument, because that's how it is in Overwatch as well, right? But point being, you can't just like keep relying on outpicking the enemy team. You have to actually rely on some sense of competitive mechanics. You have to find some sort of advantage from the options you have instead of just having an infinitely expanding range of options that end up hurting the game so much. You don't need an infinitely expanding range of options. You need to be given a range of options to see what you can work with to prove yourself as a player and to really just have the game have some sense of competitive viability. Like, at some point things have to stop, right? Now, Team Fortress 2 doesn't really get updates anymore. Added new weapons for a while. I'd say it's in a pretty decent state, though. A lot of the time the community just bans things outright if they aren't that healthy. Not entirely unique. But, again, TF2 established a sense of consistency. These are 9 classes. This is what these classes can do. Here are your options. Have some more options. Go work with it. And the community loves that. We love that. It is such a huge part of the game. You have your friendly heavies with sandwiches, who usually also have like specific cosmetics. You have Pybros with all these different weapons. Like you'll have Homewrecker, Degreaser just playing supportively there. But it's the same tool set, just in a different way, right? It's the same, or rather, I don't know, like, it can't be the same tool set, but point is, it's always the same starting point. Like, it's always diverging, but then it reconverges at a certain point as well. You might have 2 different Pyros, but at the end of the day, they both still play Pyro. They both still have a somewhat baseline rule. That argument might not apply as much to something like Demo Knight, seeing as just how different the class is. But you take something like pretty much anything, you know? You have your mech switch to Kritzkrieg, you have your Pyro use Detonator, Flog, Dragon's Fury, Shotgun, Homewrecker, whatever other weapon you want, and they're going to have to play differently to make the most use out of those weapons. But they're still a Pyro at the end of the day, and you can't just get some stupendous advantage off of having some sort of like better selection. Now, I'm not trying to like downplay the value off of selection and something like Counter-Strike. It's great because it all ends up coming down like to like mechanics and knowledge. Like, but then in Overwatch, when selection is basically all there is to the depth of the game, all that matters is selection, and thus nobody is truly that unique as a player. Unless you somehow have, like, such good mechanics or ability to select that you rule people, right? But it's important that you can't just get a huge advantage through selection, but that you still have selection. And that's the dynamic that TF2 strikes that other games don't really match. That's the level of agency that it gives you. You combine that with the cosmetics, and you have something really wonderful. And honestly, I think it just comes down to that. And I could go more into things like, I guess I'll talk about meta for a little bit here, right? Okay, let's take an example of Team Fortress 2 meta. Real quick, casually, I mean, whatever works, that's great. You don't have arbitrary limits, like, unless you're in some community servers, it's all fun, people could work it out for themselves. The casual competitive modes are pretty different, you know, that's fine, it's okay. But it's just, like, we're still discovering a lot of things as a whole, right? And to elaborate on that, I'm going to point to something that kind of recently like got brought up, talked about. So, Panic Attack and Liberty Launcher. Okay? Now you might ask, why do you run that loadout? Why would you run that loadout? So I actually can't demonstrate, I guess, thanks to Localtopia. But the idea is, right, instead of just focusing on, like, playing a bit of a slower game, focusing on multi-target engagement and control, you're really specializing in 1v1. And why is that, you might ask? Liberty Launcher, more rockets, okay. Panic Attack, faster switch speed, okay? So what you end up doing is you just end up switching back and forth between Liberty Launcher, Panic Attack. You shoot pretty much at the same time, like you hold your switch key, like, and press M1 at the same time, and you get a quick 2-tap. And while this was discovered in competitive a decently long time ago before, it's just like we're still only finding out about these things, or at least like only really like getting that much of publicity towards them and much understanding of them today. Now think about how long it's been since the last TF2 update, and compare that to games where you always just have static weapon choices, or where it's like an arena shooter. You know, it's just a different sort of legacy gameplay-wise. And TF2's is really lasting because of this. Now, from a sheerly competitive standpoint, I'm going to be taking a look at Swiftwater. Sure, you know the map. Green, long, whatever. So, the second point. Attacking team. The upper part of the second point, you know, the little apartment shutter area with the window. Teams, for the longest time in competitive 9v9, thought that you just keep throwing your heads against the wall by going through the shutter over and over again, hoping you get a better Rubik exchange than an enemy team, out-coordinating, like getting your flank in the right position at the right time, getting spy to sap, so on and so forth, or just having your pyro like sack through with a phlogistonator to try and get a force. Just doing that process over and over again. They were like, okay, this isn't working. But you can't just outpick the enemy team there, so what do you do with the current tools you have, right? So teams look at the map, they look at the tools they have, and they're like, okay, we'll try tunnel instead. You know what? A tunnel push worked better. Force the enemy team to come down to bait you. Don't just go through a shutter that's super deniable by a pyro. And by the way, I'm just going to briefly stand up at this again. The mechanical consistency is very important. A pyro can almost always do at a baseline what pyro can do, and there's an understanding of that on specific points in competitive especially. So you're not just going to find yourself in a position where, oh, we would really be winning if we had X class, X hero, so on and so forth. You might find yourself getting diffed by a loadout choice, but that is much, much more involved than just picking from a list of like 40 different characters. But anyways, okay, back to the topic at hand. Tunnel push. Works out a lot better for the most part. Some teams just don't really know what to do with it. They don't understand it. They just understand the fact that the meta has changed, right? Whatever. You know, sometimes stuff just doesn't work out. You don't get the correct understanding of things. You just try and do the same things. If it's not based off of just having a perfect counter or cheese to switch to, it ends up being much more mechanically involves a chance of error, and it's much healthier and competitive because you can't just keep copy-pasting the same strategies. That's cool. But then you take it a step further. Back to the weapon choice, back to the weapons, back to learning about the meta still, even at the top of the game, even in competitive. You look at Soldier. Now, what is Soldier doing there? Okay, in the past, he'd try and sack through sometimes, through the shutter. He'd get people whip, he'd go through. Okay, he gets air blasted back by pyro. Now, teams decide, okay, let's revisit up, you know, maybe there's something different we can do there now that, like, people have started learning to counterplay tunnel, it's become a little bit less effective, or we just want to try something different. I might be a little off in the chronology here, you know, maybe teams did this before the tunnel, but you look at the Mantreds, one of the best teams in Invite North American Highlander, they see 75% reduction in air blast vulnerability. You look at the Beggar's Bazooka, very high burst damage, you release it against a medic near a wall, probably either going to force a kill him, and the pyro isn't as likely to just entirely deny it. So what ends up happening is, you see a team just send a soldier with a whip, maybe a banner, buff as well, through upper, maybe with a pyro or something as well, I really don't remember the specifics, but you just send them through. Now, because they have 75% more reduction to air blast, like knockback-wise, they're able to just physically walk past the pyro, and get the force on the medic. And that's really cool. Again, that's only something we've discovered recently. Swiftwater has been played since I don't even know how long, at least like 2016, I want to say, in competitive. And it's entirely different from casual competitive, so that's cool. But we're still figuring these things out, even with some of the best players. I believe it is Anthony or something like that in sixes. Uses the Beggar's Bazooka. Troll Banny has a video on it. Very unique stuff. Very interesting. all these weapons just have their own niche uses. Even if we haven't really like discovered all of them yet, there's still some out there. There's still so much room left for TF2's meta to grow and shape itself. Especially think about this, right? Even if we start like solving a lot of these things in competitive or like with videos about like certain loadouts, there's so many players as well, like especially newer players, or people who just aren't as interested in what other people have to say, and you have all these options on just how to play. And you're not going to see them all instantly know just what to do in what circumstances, what loadout to run, and so on and so forth. And again, there's just this absolutely unmatched ability to define yourself as a player, to grow as a player, and to really hone on specific mechanics and do things that you can't really do in other games in that sense. The sheer level of diversity and depth is so amazing. And it's pretty much always going to remain like this consistent, unless something like the bot issue becomes a lot worse. Now, I'm sure there's more specific examples that could go into, more rambling or tangents that I could go into, but I don't really feel the need to. I think it's pretty self-explanatory once you start being able to like rationalize some arguments for yourself, so I think I'll go and end it here. Yeah.